Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of seizures. We'll be exploring what they are, the different types, common triggers, and even some lesser-known ones that you might not have heard of before. So by the end of this deep dive, you'll have a pretty solid understanding of the basics of seizures. And this can be really helpful, whether it's for your own knowledge or even for helping someone you know who might experience them. So let's get started. What exactly is a seizure?
Well, it can be helpful to think of a seizure as a sudden electrical storm in the brain. Basically, it's this surge of electrical activity that disrupts the brain's normal functioning. And this can lead to a whole variety of symptoms depending on which part of the brain is actually affected.
Okay, so it's like this sudden burst of energy that kind of throws things off balance.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the symptoms depend on where in the brain this happens.
Exactly. You see, different parts of the brain are responsible for different functions. Right. So let's say a seizure in the occipital lobe, which handles vision, that might cause some visual disturbances. But a seizure in the motor cortex, which controls movement, could lead to muscle spasms.
That makes sense. It's like different neighborhoods in the brain having different reactions to this electrical surge. Now, our sources talk about two main types of seizures, focal seizures and generalized seizures. What's the difference between those two?
Well, focal seizures are kind of like localized events. They start in one specific area of the brain, almost like a small group of brain cells just suddenly misfiring. And as we just discussed, the symptoms really depend on which area is affected.
Well, it's like a small electrical storm brewing in just one part of the city.
Precisely. Now, within focal seizures, there are two subtypes: focal aware and focal impaired awareness.
So what's the difference between those two?
Well, in focal aware seizures, the person actually remains conscious throughout the whole seizure. They're aware of what's happening, even though they might be experiencing some unusual sensations or movements. It's almost like they're observing the storm from a distance.
And what about focal impaired awareness?
So in focal impaired awareness seizures, the person's consciousness is affected. They might seem confused, dazed, or even unresponsive. It's like they're caught in the middle of the storm and they can't quite grasp what's going on around them.
Our sources provide some really interesting examples of how these different types of focal seizures can actually look. For instance, someone having a focal aware seizure might experience a tingling sensation in their hand, while someone having a focal impaired awareness seizure might just stare blankly and not respond to any questions.
Exactly. The symptoms can be so varied, and they really depend on the individual and the specific area of the brain that's affected.
Now, what about generalized seizures? Those sound a lot more intense.
Yeah. Generalized seizures are like a full-blown electrical storm engulfing the entire brain. They involve both sides of the brain right from the start, and they typically lead to a loss of consciousness.
So it's like the whole city is experiencing a blackout.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And just like with focal seizures, there are also different types of generalized seizures.
Okay, let's break those down a little bit. What are some of the most common types of generalized seizures?
Probably the most well-known type is the tonic-clonic seizure. It's sometimes called a grand mal seizure. This is what most people actually picture when they think of a seizure. The body stiffening followed by those rhythmic jerking movements.
Right, like a full body convulsion. That's one you often see depicted in movies and TV shows.
Exactly. Then there are absent seizures, which are much more subtle. They often involve just brief staring spells, almost like daydreaming. And these can be easily missed, especially in children.
So it's like a momentary lapse in awareness.
Precisely. We also have myoclonic seizures, which are characterized by sudden, brief muscle jerks. These can involve just one part of the body or even multiple parts.
Like a sudden twitch or spasm.
Right. And then we have atonic seizures. These cause a sudden loss of muscle tone, which can lead to falls. They're sometimes referred to as drop attacks.
Wow, that sounds pretty scary. It's amazing how many different ways seizures can present themselves.
It really is. And it's important to remember that not everyone with epilepsy, which is a condition characterized by recurrent seizures, will experience all of these types. The types of seizures someone has and how they experience them can be very individual.
So we've covered what seizures are and the different types. But what causes these electrical storms in the first place? What triggers them?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, there isn't always a simple answer. Some seizures are what we call provoked, meaning there's a clear, identifiable trigger, but others are unprovoked, meaning the cause is unknown or harder to pinpoint.
So it's like trying to figure out why a circuit breaker tripped. Sometimes it's obvious, like someone plugged in too many appliances. But other times, it's a total mystery.
Exactly. But let's talk about some of the known seizure triggers. Our sources highlight several common ones, and many of them are things most people experience in their daily lives. One of the most common triggers is lack of sleep.
I know, I definitely get cranky without enough sleep. But a seizure, that's a whole other level.
Yeah, sleep deprivation can really disrupt that delicate balance of brain chemicals, and that makes the brain much more susceptible to seizures. In fact, it's one of the most frequently reported triggers for breakthrough seizures in people with epilepsy.
So getting enough sleep is not just about feeling good, it's about protecting your brain health.
Absolutely. And it's not just insufficient sleep that can be a problem. Excessive sleep can actually also increase seizure risk in some individuals. It's all about finding that sweet spot, that optimal amount of sleep for your body.
Okay, so sleep is a big one. What else should we be mindful of?
Well, stress is another major culprit. Our sources consistently highlight it as a significant trigger. You see, stress hormones can really affect brain activity, and that makes seizures more likely.
Stress is the worst. And if you're already predisposed to seizures, I can see how it could push you over the edge.
Exactly. Another common trigger is missed medication. If you rely on medication to control your seizures, missing doses can disrupt that control and increase the risk of a seizure.
That seems pretty straightforward. You need the medication to keep those electrical storms in check.
Right. Alcohol is another trigger to be aware of. Excessive alcohol consumption can alter brain chemistry and lower the seizure threshold.
Even in people who don't have epilepsy.
Yes, even in people without a history of seizures, binge drinking or chronic alcohol abuse can increase their seizure risk. It's all about moderation and being mindful of how alcohol affects your body.
Good to know. Our sources also mention hormonal changes, especially in women, as a potential trigger. Can you explain why that is?
Sure, hormonal fluctuations, particularly those related to the menstrual cycle, can affect neurotransmitter levels in the brain. And these neurotransmitters play a key role in regulating brain activity. So when their levels fluctuate, it can make seizures more likely.
So it's like those hormonal shifts create a ripple effect in the brain.
Exactly. And it's not just menstrual cycles. Other hormonal changes, such as those that occur during puberty, pregnancy, or menopause, can also affect seizure risk.
Wow. It's amazing how interconnected everything is. Hormones, sleep, stress, they all play a role.
That's right. It's all about understanding those connections and how they impact our health. And it's all about understanding those connections and how they can impact our health.
So we've covered some of the big players when it comes to seizure triggers, but I'm curious about those lesser-known triggers you mentioned earlier. Those sound really intriguing.
They are, and they often catch people off guard, things you might not immediately associate with seizures.
So let's unravel these mysteries. What are some of these unexpected culprits?
Well, one that often surprises people is specific sounds, certain sounds like church bells or specific songs or even someone's voice have been reported to trigger seizures in some individuals.
It's almost like those sounds create a very particular pattern of brain activity
Yeah.
that in susceptible individuals sets off a seizure.
That's precisely it. Our brains are so incredibly complex and they respond to stimuli in ways we're still trying to fully understand. And for some people, certain sounds seem to hit a neurological nerve, so to speak, and trigger that cascade of electrical activity that leads to a seizure.
It's fascinating how something as seemingly innocuous as a particular sound can have such a profound neurological effect.
It is, and it really highlights the importance of paying attention to those individual triggers. What might be completely harmless to one person could be a significant trigger for someone else.
Okay, so sounds can be a trigger. What other surprising triggers did you find in the research?
This one might surprise you even more. Certain cognitive activities like reading, writing, or even solving math problems have been reported to trigger seizures in some individuals.
That's so wild. You think of those activities as being good for your brain, not potentially harmful.
It's all about individual brain chemistry and how each brain is wired. For some people, engaging in these activities might create a specific pattern of brain activity that, for whatever reason, increases their susceptibility to seizures. It's not that the activities themselves are inherently bad. It's just that they can be triggers for certain individuals.
It's a good reminder that everyone's brain is unique, and what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. And it's why it's so crucial to listen to your body and pay attention to any potential triggers.
So sounds and cognitive activities can be triggers. What else is on this list of unexpected culprits?
Well, believe it or not, even changes in the weather have been linked to seizures in some people.
Really? I've heard of people's joints aching when the weather changes, but seizures?
It might seem strange, but there's some evidence to suggest that fluctuations in barometric pressure, humidity, or temperature can affect seizure susceptibility in some individuals. It's not fully understood why, but it's thought that these weather changes might alter the electrical activity in the brain, making seizures more likely.
It's amazing how sensitive our brains are to the environment around us.
It is, and it's another reminder that we're constantly interacting with our environment, and those interactions can have a real impact on our health.
Okay, so weather changes, unexpected as it may seem, can be a trigger. What other surprising triggers did you come across?
Prepare to be even more surprised. Certain essential oils like juniper have been reported to trigger seizures in some people.
Essential oils. Those are supposed to be calming and therapeutic.
They can be for many people, but just like any substance, essential oils can have different effects on different people. And for some individuals with epilepsy, certain essential oils, particularly those that are stimulating like juniper, can actually increase seizure risk. It's thought that these oils might affect neurotransmitter levels in the brain, making seizures more likely.
It's a good reminder to be cautious with any new substance or therapy, even those that are generally considered safe.
Absolutely. It's always best to consult with your doctor before starting any new treatment, especially if you have a history of seizures.
And speaking of things we put in or on our bodies, did you find anything about food as a potential trigger?
I did, and this one might be the most surprising of all. Some people experience seizures triggered by specific foods. There's even a term for it, eating epilepsy.
Eating epilepsy. So the act of eating itself can trigger a seizure.
In some cases, yes. For people with eating epilepsy, certain foods or even the act of eating itself can trigger a seizure. It's not fully understood why, but it's thought to involve a complex interplay of factors, including the specific foods being eaten, the person's individual metabolism, and their seizure threshold.
So what kind of foods are we talking about here? Are there any common culprits?
The triggers can vary widely from person to person, but some of the foods that have been reported to trigger seizures in people with eating epilepsy include things like caffeine alcohol, chocolate-aged cheeses, processed meats, and artificial sweeteners. It really seems to depend on the individual.
It's mind-boggling how something as basic as eating can be a potential seizure trigger.
It is, and it highlights the importance of paying attention to your body's signals. If you notice that certain foods seem to trigger seizures, it's important to talk to your doctor and consider keeping a food diary to track those potential triggers.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Common triggers, lesser known, triggers the impact of dehydration. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but the key takeaway is this: triggers are incredibly individual. What affects one person may not affect another, and what might trigger a seizure one day might not trigger it the next. It's a complex interplay of factors.
So how do you figure out what your specific seizure triggers might be? How do you crack the code?
That's where things get really practical and a bit like detective work. Our sources consistently recommend keeping a seizure diary. Think of it as a log where you track everything related to your seizures and the events leading up to them.
Right, like a detailed record of all the potential clues.
Exactly. And in this diary, you'll want to note everything you can think of: the date and time of the seizure, how long it lasted, what kind of symptoms you experienced, what you were doing before the seizure, what you ate and drank, how much sleep you got, your stress levels, whether you took your medication as prescribed, and anything else you think might be relevant.
It's like building a timeline of events to see if any patterns emerge, and I imagine this information is super helpful for your doctor, too.
Absolutely. By analyzing this data, both you and your doctor can start to identify potential triggers and develop a more targeted treatment plan. Sometimes patterns might jump out at you right away. Other times, it might require careful analysis and collaboration with your healthcare provider to connect the dots.
So it's a combination of self-monitoring and working with your doctor to crack the case.
Exactly. And remember, even if you don't have identifiable triggers, keeping a seizure diary can still be incredibly helpful. It provides valuable information for your doctor and can help you better understand your seizures.
This whole discussion of triggers has been super insightful. But before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, let's take a moment to remind our listeners to engage with us. If you're enjoying this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the Allison Knows podcast. You can find us on Spotify and YouTube. Just search for Allison Knows. We'll be right back to wrap up our exploration of seizures. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Allison Knows podcast. We're wrapping up our deep dive into the world of seizures, and I have to say this has been a truly enlightening conversation.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to explore all these complexities with you. Seizures are often so misunderstood, and I think it's important to shed some light on this topic.
Absolutely. So before we sign off, let's take a moment to recap what we've learned and leave our listeners with some key takeaways.
Sounds good. Where should we begin?
We started by defining what a seizure actually is: a sudden surge of electrical activity in the brain. And this activity disrupts the brain's normal functioning. We talked about how it's kind of like an electrical storm, but instead of lightning and thunder, you get these neurological symptoms. And these symptoms can manifest in so many different ways.
Right, and we emphasize that those specific symptoms really depend on which part of the brain is affected. It's like different neighborhoods in the brain reacting differently to that electrical disturbance.
Exactly. And then we went on to those two main categories of seizures. focal seizures, and generalized seizures. Focal seizures are more like localized events. They start in one specific area of the brain, while generalized seizures involve the whole brain right from the start.
Yeah, and we talked about how focal seizures can sometimes spread to become generalized seizures. It's kind of like a small brush fire suddenly turning into a raging inferno.
And within those categories, we explored all those different types of seizures: tonic-clonic seizures, absent seizures, myoclonic seizures, atonic seizures. It's really amazing how diverse these seizures can be, both in how they look and how they affect the person experiencing them.
It's a reminder that seizures aren't a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. Each person's experience is unique.
Absolutely. And then we moved into that fascinating world of seizure triggers, those things that can set off a seizure in susceptible individuals. We talked about those common culprits like lack of sleep stress, missed medication, alcohol. Those are the things that often come up in conversations about seizures,
Right, but then we dug a little deeper and uncovered some of those lesser-known triggers, the ones that often surprise people, things you wouldn't necessarily associate with seizures right off the bat.
like specific sounds, certain cognitive activities like reading or doing math changes in the weather, certain essential oils, and even certain foods.
Yeah, and all these unexpected triggers highlight how complex and individualized seizure triggers can actually be. What might be completely harmless to one person could be a significant trigger for somebody else.
And that's why we talked about the importance of self-monitoring and keeping a seizure diary. It's like being a detective. You're tracking all those potential clues, what you were doing, what you were eating and drinking, how much sleep you got, your stress levels, to try and see if any patterns emerge.
It's about taking control of your health and being proactive in managing your seizures, working closely with your doctor to analyze that data and develop a more targeted treatment plan.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something for you to ponder. Think about everything we've discussed today and consider how this knowledge might apply to your own life or the life of someone you know. Could there be subtle signs you've been overlooking? Could keeping a simple log of your daily activities reveal patterns you weren't even aware of? Knowledge is power, and the more you understand about seizures, the better equipped you'll be to navigate this complex world. And remember, even if you don't have seizures yourself, this knowledge can help you support others who do. Understanding and empathy can go a long way in creating a more inclusive and supportive environment for people living with epilepsy.
I completely agree. Knowledge really empowers us to break down stigma and foster that understanding.
Well, thank you for joining us for another deep dive on the Allison Knows podcast. We hope you found this exploration insightful and empowering. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the show with your friends. You can find us on Spotify and YouTube. Just search for Allison Knows. Thank you for listening to the Allison Knows podcast. Follow Allison on Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok.